Hi guys, I'm Brad Montgomery and welcome to The Breakdown, and here we talk about science, psychology, and investing. Today we're going to be talking about adults living at home. Before we get started, if you missed any of our past conversations, you can catch any of our episodes at kfoxtv.com/The Breakdown and listen along on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, let's break it down. I'm with Ashley Hassinger, and you're a licensed clinical therapist. And we're going to be talking about adults living at home, kind of the pros and cons and what leads to that, and maybe some instances where it may go on too long and maybe what you can do. And so we're going to dive right in. But before we start to go down that road, we have a viewer question.
Yes, we do, Brad. So we have a viewer question that says, I had to move back home and I feel like a failure, but a lot of my friends say that it's not a sign of failure anymore. Am I overthinking this? Is living at home still a bad thing, or is it more common?
Yes, living at home is very common. It's very, very common, especially during the pandemic and after the pandemic. A lot of young adults wanted to save money. It also became customary. You were able to work from home. It was not an issue. You could work from home, do that with ease. And I think, too, there's other factors to consider. Maybe there's medical reasons why that person has come back home, or maybe the cost of school was just too expensive to be on campus. Maybe it's better to commute. So there's a bunch of different factors to consider when it comes to a trend. But also I wanted to kind of touch on the fact from a cultural lens. It's a cultural norm, especially us being on the border town, for people to live at home, young adults to live at home with their family for many, many years until they're ready to. Exactly. To get, some, especially with Catholicism, it's very customary to stay at home until you're married.
Right.
So those are the, what I think is more of a trend, so to speak, is.
Now, it's funny, you mentioned financial, and I can't remember what class I was in. I had a junior college class, and this was in the late 90s, and one of my professors was actually struggling with it, and he kind of opened up to us. It may have been a sociology class, and he was telling us how his son had moved out, but his son was needing to move back in. But he was kind of saying, that's not how it was done. And back in the day, it wasn't really, it's much more common. You moved out, you started a family, and you went on. And he was kind of grappling with that concept of his son coming back home. But at the same time, he was admitting things are getting more expensive now. And I think maybe even pre-pandemic was cost of living a pretty big driver.
Yes, I definitely think it was a huge driver, especially because it was a lot cheaper. I mean, even the price in rent, it's significantly different. On prior service, when we got here and we were just looking for a place to rent, it was very inexpensive. I mean, you could get a 2,000 square foot home, for maybe $1,000 a month, and that's nice, But now it's like $2,000 a month for rent just to have, a little place, or even $1,500 to $2,000 for an apartment, and what a lot of young adults are doing, if they are going out on their own, is they're kind of buddying up with friends and they're going in on it together.
So what are essentially financial, and I stayed at home for a little bit as well. You can actually get a pretty good financial gain if you do that right, if that's your intention. If not, you just kind of get the inadvertent benefits. You've got more money if you're going to be going out with your friends and stuff, right? But what are some of the other positive benefits of adults maybe living at home or staying at home a little bit longer? What are there any really? When it comes to psychological aspects, are there more negatives than positives, or is it generally positive?
No, I think that's a case-by-case situation as far as negatives and positives. On the positive side of it, you have more stability being at home. A meal every day. Parents, depending on mom or dad, they may say, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll do your laundry, or I'll clean your room," and so there's that comfortability and that stability that being at home can offer you. And at the same time, you can save money. You can take your time. I think it's really important that parents understand that you're giving your child that opportunity, your adult that opportunity to really grow at their own pace. And I think that's something to consider, that being a benefit. And then for parents, I feel it's a benefit as far as companionship. That's something that's huge. We don't really consider that, but we go through that empty nest phase when our children leave the house and we don't know what to do with ourselves. We put all our energy and our time into into our children, and then when they're adults, it's like, oh my gosh, now what do I do? So that on that side of things, I think that it's a good thing. But maybe on the negative for them is maybe the parents have a difference of values than their child. Now their lifestyle choices are changing, and they're coming into themselves, and they didn't experience a whole lot of resistance when they were younger.
Right.
Your parents can tell you to do something and you did it. But now it's like, oh, well, you're coming into yourself. You do have a difference of opinion, and it may not be congruent with how I think, so there may be some conflict there.
Yeah, I personally, just a little bit, I didn't have much conflict, like you said, it's case by case, and the companionship, I hadn't even thought about that. I think that's wonderful for the parents. I think it's a benefit for both sides, even as you alluded to. But for me, I remember when I started having my first serious relationship, and I wanted to kind of be away, and then when I was coming home, and so all of a sudden there were these issues that we'd never dealt with before, and I could see their side of it as well, and I did give a little bit, and they gave a little bit as well, and we both kind of gave, and then after I dated the girl for a couple of years, and they were fine with her and everything like that, but initially, it's interesting as you're going along, even those things can kind of come up that you didn't necessarily, everything's running really smooth, and then here we are, maybe 3, 4, 5 months in, or maybe a year and a half in, and this has changed a little bit. Dynamic changes. Now there's a little more tension. So that's interesting. And what are some unexpected kind of side effects that in that area that can come up with adults staying at home longer?
I think you hit on a really good point. When you're looking to date, it's different if you're on your own. You can date freely, but you're kind of under the microscope when you're under your parents' roof. So you do have that aspect of things from the dating perspective, but also too, your parents, like I was saying before, they may have rigid boundaries around certain things. They may set a curfew and still kind of stick to that. They feel, as long as you're living in my house, these are my rules, and you have to respect it. And I think it's important to come to some type of agreement or a compromise with your young adult and say, okay, where can we have a happy medium? And I think that's really important. Like you said, there was some pushback between you and your parents, but you guys kind of sat down and hashed it out. And I think that's really important.
And one of those, you talk about under their roof. Boy, that's one thing when you get older, you don't miss hearing that. But I mean, and I didn't hear it a lot, but man, because it's like, okay, I know. But it was one of the things where, as I got older, he said, all you have to do, my dad pretty much was like, as long as you're going to school or working, then he's like, I'll pretty much leave you alone. And I did both. So that kind of covered both of those bases. And he kind of did. I'll do his work. He kind of left me alone a little bit. But I think that's where you can maybe run into problems too, where maybe you're going into it initially and boundaries are set. And then maybe someone doesn't want to follow their side, or I had a friend, I think his working was a little more hit and miss than his parents would like. And I remember as we got older, when I would go visit, there would be a little more tension as a result. If that does happen, let's take it from the parent side first, because I don't know this to be true, but I think if there's going to be some slacking going on, it may be on the child side a little more. So from the parent side, how could that be addressed in maybe a better way or a best way?
So when you say address, you mean just taking someone if they're not maybe growing at the rate that you see them growing.
And you say, hey, we kind of agreed to this, or do you let it slide? I mean, what's how much give do you give?
I don't think there's a manual on parenting. That's let's
true.
Just start there. But as far as that's concerned, I think it's important. Communication is so key. If you just sit down, maybe there's something that's getting in the way for your child that you're not privy to. Maybe they don't feel comfortable enough to talk to you about it, because maybe they feel, you're doing all this for me. You're giving me a place to stay. You're feeding me. You're helping me. You're being a support. I don't want to bring my mess to you. I just want to try to show you the best way that I can. But somewhere along the line, us as parents, we see everything. We observe everything. We know that something's amiss. And so if you notice that your child doesn't have as much motivation, or maybe they're having restless nights, or they're overthinking, just take the time to just sit down and talk to them. Ask them what's going on. Talk to me. Is there anything that I can do to help? Because we feel as though maybe there's judgment that may come.
Well, and that's what you took the words right out of my mouth. So judgment, because and if they feel like, and the bad thing is like it doesn't even have to be really spoken. If they feel like they're going to be judged, they're going to back away. Right. So how do you make them feel like you're not, like you have their best intentions at heart? How do you make them feel okay?
I think that it's not just recognizing their losses, but recognizing the small wins. Okay. If you realize that your child's struggling and they're struggling to get up, celebrate that they got up that morning, they took a shower, they sat in front of the computer, they started to do their resume, send their resume out. Like those are wins. And I think that's something that a lot of parents may miss. They may see the end goal for their child, but if that child is struggling with something, or that young adult is struggling with something, like you said, judgment, if their peers are doing better than them, they don't want that judgment from their parents, but they expect it because they've gotten it from everyone else.
Right. Okay.
So I just think it's about nurturing. Nurturing doesn't stop when you're a child. As adults, we need it too. Okay,
that makes sense. So that's the approach. Okay. Now, and what impact can it have? And this is, you kind of alluded to this, but I want to go a little deeper in this. What impact can it have psychologically on a child living at home for a longer period of time? Now, you've said, obviously you get companionship for the parents and also for the child too, which can come in handy, especially in the crazy dating world and stuff like that. So that's a good fallback, that family structure. Right. But are there any, what can some of the negative impacts be if it runs on too long?
I definitely think one of the key ones is codependency. And on the part of not just the parent, but on the part of the child. And, say if I'm super dependent on my mother or my father to kind of bail me out of situations, I'm not going to know how to handle unexpected events when I go out on my own.
Right.
Same thing with our parents. Some of them will experience the empty nest at, say, 18. When their child's 18, they leave off to college. But say your child's 30 by the time they leave, that's a little bit harder to let go.
Oh, really?
I've seen some parents where it's very difficult to let go when their child's a lot older, because now you not only form that attachment as a young, when they were young, but now as a young adult, the relationship's ever evolving. Wow. It changes over time. When you're, like we talked about, if your child comes into their own, watching them grow, watching them come into their own, watching everything unfold, you're enmeshed in that. It's not like they're doing it off at college. So that codependency may be an issue if it goes on too long. And also, like I was saying, the lack of independence on that person's part, the young adult, because they're so accustomed to having that stability, parents doing everything for them.
So they'll be lost as an adult.
Yes. So as an adult, we may, as parents, be hindering our children in a way by doing too much for them. And that's really hard as a parent, because you want to do absolutely everything for your child, and they're your child forever, even when they're old.
Well, I don't want to do everything for I like seeing my child do some stuff for herself.
Yes,
but I know what you're saying. I've seen the other side of that coin. But
right.
That's how kind of my parents were with me. Is like they're like, no, you can do that. I remember my dad used to kind of drive nuts a little bit when I was young. If I and I kind of get on my daughter about this, but he would, if I couldn't find something like my car or whatever, instantly I would ask my mom, and my dad's like, look for it, and so now my daughter, where's the remote? Where'd you put it?
Right.
So.
But I think that's good because it teaches them to be accountable, and even if it's small as, we'll find it, you're not going to always have the answer readily available.
True.
So I think like in that way, we don't have to be authoritative figures as parents. We can parent and teach social and life skills that way, just doing the simple day-to-day things.
And that can be like even ongoing from young right all the way through.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that's interesting where you talk about the codependency. That would be obviously a negative. So what age are we looking at where things have kind of run on for a while and nobody's keeping track of the days. A lot of times we don't even keep track of the years. So things have kind of run on, and I know every situation's different, but what age would you recommend, maybe, obviously like you said, if you both of you are running a business that's a totally different thing.
Right.
But if it's just your typical parent-child relationship, what age would you recommend maybe them trying to get out on their own? At what point?
I like I said, I think that is subjective.
Subjective.
It
Okay.
really is.
Yeah.
It depends on the family dynamic, because
Okay.
if your parent is, say, sick, or
Yeah.
like you said, you're helping that parent run a business, there's no timeline on
That's
it.
true.
You know, I just feel, and this is a good gauge for parents, as long as your child is being productive and you see that your child is moving forward and not being complacent and stagnant, let that be your guide.
Okay.
That would be the best advice that I can give, my own personal advice, just because we may see that our child is really trying, they're putting themselves out there, but maybe that particular field that they're in, there's not that much room for them. Maybe
Right.
it's a high demand type of position, and they're filled, you know.
Yeah,
and by the time anybody's out of that, say, role, they're old and retired, you know.
That's
So I think that it just depends on that. But as long as you see that your child's moving forward and they're doing their best, that should be an indicator for you that, you know what, maybe it's not time right now, whenever
that's
you're
good.
ready.
Yeah, and that's key. I think that is key, because, you know, there's and we're actually talking about this even amongst ourselves with the producers. We're talking about, you know, if you have to go back home and help with that, and that's a whole nother, you know, ball of wax that we can get into one day.
Yes.
But I mean, on this one, I think that I remember while I was living at home, I was a loan officer, and so it didn't, you know, my parents weren't really bothered. I mean, I was going to work, and I mean, everything was fine. But I think that's the key. And I think it's interesting, because in my head, I was looking for like a set age, and not like, you know, down to the year.
Right. But like kind of like a
range, you know, even,
Yes.
you know, but then I like your way a lot better, where you're like, no, are they being productive? Are they moving forward? You know, or are they not? Are they falling back? You know, and that's a much better gauge, I think, to go by. Okay. So now, how have you seen kind of the dynamic change if the parent and the child live at home for like a long period of time? We mentioned like it can change the child in a way, like it kind of can give them a lack of adult skills if they get out on their own.
Yes.
Is there any way it can change the parent if it runs on very, very, very long?
Well, I feel like I said, like as far as that codependency,
Just hard to let
you
go.
know, it's hard to let go for
Yeah.
some parents. But at the same time, one thing I think that's really important is that some parents may compare. They do a lot of comparing to other people's kids. Where are their kids at? You know, and so there's that impact there for the parents. When do I tighten the grip? When do I loosen the grip? And that's kind of like an internal battle.
So on the
that
parent
you
side,
have.
that's what they worry about.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
Interesting. That's
So
interesting.
it's like, well, do I let my child learn on their own with this particular, or do I protect them? You know, because sometimes, and some young adults may see it as their parent being like this authoritative figure, but it's more or less them coming from a place of protection. I want to protect you. I don't want to expose you to all this bad.
But that can go too far.
Exactly,
as well.
exactly. And I think that's important to try to find a happy medium. You know, where is it to a place where we can have a good functioning relationship, but you don't feel like I'm smothering you,
Right.
but you also don't feel like I don't care.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that middle area. So now back to just the situation of child living at home. How much, and I know it is very situational, just like we've been talking about multiple times here.
Yes.
But how much, what's a healthy range of freedom versus rules that you should have? Kind of what should be your gauge to kind of go by, where you're not encouraging them to kind of put their feet up on the couch and watch TV all day,
Right.
versus, you're not, why are you still in the house? Why aren't you at work?
Right.
So what's the best kind of gauge to push them healthily along that journey of eventually independence, or as much, even within the household, the most independent, productive person they can be? What's the best way to push them while living at home? Especially if they need that push.
How many kids do you have, Bradley? You said you have a couple. Like,
I got one.
You've got one.
Yeah,
okay.
one
Well,
daughter.
how would you describe your daughter's personality? Would you say she's reliable?
Yeah,
If she listens?
she's super honest and she's pretty driven.
Okay, so if coming from, just even coming from your perspective, you probably wouldn't have as much of rigid boundaries as far as it comes to her because of her personality, and that's why I think it depends on the child. Is your child the type that is really reliable? They take accountability. If you tell them to do something, they do it. They rise to the occasion. Or is your child maybe the opposite of that, where they need a little bit more structure?
Check in on them.
Yes, you need to check in on them a little more. So I think
that.
that speaks to that. You know, I go based on your child and your relationship with your child. Is your child more resistant or rebellious? Then maybe you may have to set a little bit more firmer boundaries with them versus like your child that's more maybe introverted, stays to themselves, doesn't really get into too much trouble.
That's interesting. And from what I've seen, you know, just even like brothers and sisters and stuff, they have very different personalities. I mean, and it's there was a guy, he was he's a billionaire investor, and he was talking about his kids. Somebody asked about his kids and raising his kids, and he says they seem to be pretty much, they are who they are.
Yes.
The best you can do is kind of mold them a little bit.
That's so true.
So
that's so
they try to socialize them, you know, a little bit as you go along. So and now, just in general, like rules living at home, is it healthy to have a curfew, or does this, and like chore list, or you know, boys, girls allowed or not allowed, or does that just kind of go into play with the situation at hand and the personality?
I think that's great. I think that setting boundaries is healthy. We need boundaries. We need not only boundaries with our parents in our household, in their household, but when we have our own, when they finally get out on their own, they're going to have to set boundaries in their own house. Yeah. And so I think it's a respect thing. You know, even though you realize, okay, maybe my parents and I have a difference of views, if you are in their house, it is respectful to abide by whatever they want.
Very true.
And I think that it almost acts as a driving factor for you as a young adult if you don't really agree. This can be your time to really buckle down, save the money that you need to save, so then you're not having to be bogged down by those boundaries. You can establish your own in your own living space. Yeah,
and that can be a good driver.
Yes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't think about that. And then, you know, you mentioned, and just real quick, you mentioned the respect and the boundaries, because you've seen it where the parents don't respect the kids when they go to their house.
It's a two-way street.
It's like, wait a minute. Yeah, that's interesting. That is interesting. So basically, some rules are good because they're essentially boundaries.
Yes.
And that And
I mean, look at our society. We have rules that are set in society.
Right.
You know, you can't just walk in somewhere and walk out without paying for it.
Right.
You know. Yeah. So I don't see anything wrong with it, and it teaches them, okay, this is how it works. You know, you take accountability when you do something wrong. You know, you don't stay out till this particular time, because most parents will say there's nothing good out till past a certain time. Yep. And it is true. Yeah, it is true. Right. So, I mean, it's not like the parents are saying anything that's out of the norm.
Crazy. Yeah.
But I think as young adults, and even as teens, we feel invincible in that we know and have all the answers.
Do. Yeah, it's weird. If a guy in his 20s, you know, what you're like, yeah, you feel invincible. It's the weirdest thing, it's strange. It's very odd. So they're kind of looking out for you.
Right.
Okay, well, good. Well, where can people go to find out more information just about psychology in general, and maybe someone to talk to if they ever need?
Yeah, so they can also visit EHN's website, you know, emergencehealthnetwork.org, or if they need to talk to someone, they can call the 988 number, which is our crisis hotline. You know, and on there you'll have, on the website, we offer just different services, anything that tailors to your specific needs. But if you don't want to go through our portal, you can always just hit the internet and just type in, you know, counseling services or psychology services, and it should pop up.
Well, we learned a lot about adults living at home, kind of from front to back, with the child's perspective, as well as just as important, the parent's perspective. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Ashley Hassinger, for coming on in and talking with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me, Brad. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to comment, subscribe, and share it with your friends. You can check out our past archive of episodes on kfoxtv.com or listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for breaking it down with me, and we'll see you next time here on The Breakdown.